Hello friends, welcome to CEC Gurukul Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on women in history. Dear friends, we are going to talk on Sufism and women. And for the discussion of the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGTAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip is a prolific professor and we are always delighted to have her in the studio because we always get in-depth knowledge on the various topics. Friends, if you have any question pertaining to today's topic, while listening to us, if you feel so that your questions are to be answered, feel free to talk to us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Vip, once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Geetika. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. So, friends, as we were discussing the important role that women have played in Indian history, and we have also discussed different facets of that. We have talked about their cultural contribution, their contribution in medieval polity, in Zenana politics, and also trade and commerce. But today's topic is slightly different. In this, we would be talking about the important role played by women in religion, specifically medieval religion with reference to Sufism. And it is widely believed that Islam or Sufism was basically geared and driven by male members of society. But if we take into consideration the varied roles that women played and the different kind of contribution that they made in this realm, then what emerges is a more holistic picture and a more balanced picture, which is also gender sensitive. So, women fulfilled many different roles in Sufism, and a very important part of Sufism was karamat or miracles. As Sufis believed that miracles could be performed only by pious individuals, and there were many women who could perform miracles and therefore they were revered. So, the very fact that it was considered permissible for women to perform miracles and also to acknowledge that they were performing miracles, that is karamat, speaks volumes about the active role that was played by women in Islam, especially during the earlier stages of religious formations. Now, women, as far as women and the genesis of Sufism is concerned, one can definitely say that the mothers, wives and daughters of Sufi masters were much sought for guidance even by the masters themselves. The Sufis in fact trace the beginning of their spiritual activities from Prophet Muhammad, who is believed to be the first Sufi who guided the believers through his through his own lifestyle of poverty, generosity and simplicity. So, after him, it was this role was assumed by many of the female members of his household. For example, his daughter Fatima and son-in-law Ali, who showed light to the Sufi community across the Islamic world. In fact, Fatima is understood as the embodiment of divine love, and it was to her that God revealed the complete meaning of Islam. Thus, veneration to her became central to Sufism, and at no point of time it was considered as un-Islamic or unethical to revere a woman saint. Then other members of Prophet's family too became reverential figures like Khadija, who was Prophet's first wife, who supported the Prophet in the initial years of his prophethood when he faced stiff opposition and danger to his life. So, here too we see the important role that was played by women, and it was even acknowledged. Then Aisha, who was his last wife, who is accepted as an outstanding scholar of Islam and of Prophet's life. It was through Aisha that the personal facts of Prophet's life became known to the wider public at large. So therefore, the role that was played by Prophet's wives was not a dormant one, but rather it was active, and it was also acknowledged by the larger community. Then Zainab was another of Prophet's influential wives, and these women were referred to as wise merchants, patrons of religion, scholars and intellectuals, which proves time and again that medieval Indian women or medieval women world over were playing a very important and active role, and their role cannot be dismissed as passive. These first generation women of Islam became important figures in Islamic history, and they continued to inspire the coming generations. However, as happens in most of the organized religions and society, and as there is a shift from tribal to a more state based society, there is a sidelining of women, and this happened in case of medieval Islam also. So while in the initial stage women were equal participants, but as the contours of Islam took shape, women were sidelined, and this development was visible in the tradition of recording the hadiths. By hadiths, one means a genre of Islamic literature which is related to Prophet Muhammad's practices and ideas, his beliefs, his ways of life, and the way he used to spend his life. So, the way hadiths were recorded greatly displayed this sidelining of women. After the Prophet's death, a tradition of recording the incidents of Prophet's life emerged, which were meant to guide the larger Muslim community in both religious as well as judicial matters. And these records were collected by conducting interviews with the very close companions of the Prophet. And definitely the women in his life played a very important and instrumental role as they divulged great details. So therefore, as far as women and hadith are concerned, there was a great reliability of information that was provided by a person and the person was decided on the basis of closeness of that person with the Prophet. So it was not that anyone would be earmarked for driving out information regarding Prophet's life. It was those people who were very close to Prophet and in whom Prophet confided greatly that they were interviewed, and some information was extracted from them. Now, in initial years, gender of the narrator was disregarded. However, from 9th century onwards, there is a steady decline in the number of female narrators. So here you can see how sidelining of women became all the more instrumental, and the same patriarchal traditions that were existing in other religions of the times, or which had been existing even in the past, became prominent in Islam also, and there was a steady decline in the number of female narrators. So women's contribution in the recording of hadith steadily declined from 9th century onwards. So as far as gender and Sufi hagiographies are concerned, there was a similar trend that was noticed here also. So the earliest extant dictionary of Sufis was compiled by Al-Sulami around 1021, and he had devoted an entire section to women Sufis, but the section is now lost. Then another important hagiography was Abu Nu'aym al-Ifshani's Hilayat al-Awliya, dated 11th century, which contains almost 28 biographies belonging to women, but only of the Prophet's generation, which again proves that after Prophet, this tendency of incorporating women in recording of biographies or acknowledging their contribution as narrators started disappearing. Then Al-Kushairi, dated 11th century. On the other hand, it does not include women in the treatise, and nor does Al-Hujwiri, again dated 11th century. So you can see there was a marked change as compared to the preceding centuries, and the very existence of women in any of such hagiographies was considered as not called for. And the only exception seems to have been Abd al-Rahman, who relates biographies of 240 women Sufis, about which was around 1/4 of the total collections. So this has been an exception and is definitely of great interest to those historians who are interested in measuring the gender dimensions of medieval Sufi philosophy. Now, as I just mentioned, that the mothers, wives and the daughters of Sufis continued to play a very important and instrumental role, though indirectly and maybe not in the theological sense, but more in the personal sense. So, a very important aspect that was acknowledged here was karamat, and many Sufi saints had mothers who could perform miracles and guide their sons on spiritual path, and this role of women was fairly acknowledged. So Nizamuddin Aulia often visited his mother Bibi Zulekha's tomb whenever he was in spiritual dilemma for guidance. Similarly, Fariduddin Ganje Shikhar also wanted his, he also depended a lot on his mother and proclaimed time and again that his mother played a very important role as his teacher as well. In fact, he also wanted to declare his widowed daughter as his spiritual successor, but could not do so because women were not accepted as Khalifas. So, which again proves the dilemma that existed. So, while the Sufis wanted to acknowledge, and they time and again acknowledged the important role played by women, but the larger social structure and the larger Sufi philosophy, which was also rooted in Islamic principles, did not really let this happen. Then Baba Farid's mother too was believed to have performed many miracles and was greatly revered. Now, if we come to the next important aspect, that is female representation in Sufi thought, this again is a very important piece of discussion, because it was this largely conveys the kind of image that Sufi thought had created regarding femininity. Sufism has a different approach to the issue of gender from conventional Islam, something that has largely been acknowledged by various scholars, and Sufi fascination with female power, with female authenticity and with female light is visible in mystical conceptions as well. So Sufism was full of symbolism and didn't accept the literal meaning of actions and words. So there are a number of places where in a Sufi writing there is a reference to the female form, but this does not really mean that it was only related to, or it was only addressed for the female followers. Rather, it had a more universal connotation. So the concept of bride, therefore, we see that was very popular and very common in various Sufi verses, and the Sufis saw themselves as the new bride who is full of hope and happiness on the prospect of meeting her groom. So the very idea of a Sufi being a bride himself became very popular, and there were some others who perceived God as a female. Ibn Arabi, who laid the theological foundation of Sufism, worshipped the feminine side of the divine. So therefore, the femininity came to be associated with divinity, and therefore a much larger perspective that emerged out of this was that of universal love and brotherhood. Then often women were projected as a yearning soul, as someone who was yearning to meet her lover and who was waiting for something to happen. And Sufis rather seek the inner meaning of symbolism, which forms an important part of their spiritual exercise. So the yearning soul seeking to know the eternal truth is symbolized as a woman, and this was largely represented in a number of works. For example, how does Rumi, what does Rumi have to convey about women? Rumi's perception of feminine is expressed in this line, the line that I am just going to utter, that is, woman is a ray of God. She is not just the earthly beloved, she is creative. So, she is creative, not created. Now, this line is very important, that it was not as if a woman was a dormant creature who was created by the God. Rather, the beauty of a woman was that she herself was creative. So, therefore, there was lot of power that was implicit in the persona of woman, which was recognized by the Sufis. In fact, in the Mevlevi order founded by Jalaluddin Rumi, women were highly respected. And so were a number of other orders also, which directly or indirectly gave important, acknowledged the importance of women, not only in terms of philosophy, but also in terms of participation. So, there were some Sufi orders in which women participated in these Sama gatherings along with the men. And it was in these Sama gatherings that music took place, there were qawwalis that were sung, and there was lot of syncretic activities that were going on. However, post Rumi, we see the members of this order performing separate samas for men and women. So, therefore, this conveys the kind of change that was coming about. Until Rumi, there was lot of intermingling of the two sexes, and it was not considered as inappropriate for women to participate in sama. But post Rumi, this change came about. So, therefore, what we observe is that patriarchy was definitely making inroads into Sufism. It always was there, but with the passage of time and with this religion assuming wider connotations and a more accepted form as it was becoming more popular among population, patriarchy also became fully established. And despite the significance attached to the feminine power of God, the basic mentality of Sufis seems to have been patriarchal. So, spiritually accomplished women were referred to as men. Now, here again there is a dilemma that needs to be acknowledged, that a woman, even if she became spiritually highly evolved, then she could not be worshipped as a woman. It was declared that because of her spirituality, because of the knowledge that a woman had achieved, she was as good as a man. And so, therefore, one finds increasing reference, repeated reference to a Sufi woman as a man. So, who was a Sufi woman? Someone who had almost become a man, who was equivalent to man, because it was considered that man by nature had been destined to acquire such deeper knowledge and insight. So, it was a matter of exception that a woman could reach that scale, that level, and so therefore, there was no harm in considering that well accomplished and well enlightened woman as a man. So, regarding Rabia, it is said that God does not regard your outward form, and when a woman becomes a man in the path of God, she is a man, and one cannot any more call her a woman. So, Rabia, who was a great enlightened woman, soul, was declared as a man because she had achieved all this knowledge in the path of God. So therefore there was no need for her to remain a woman. Regarding Fatima of Nishapur, Abu Yazid once said, "Whoever wished to see a true man disguised as a woman, let him see Fatima." So here again Fatima was compared to a man. In fact, it was declared that Fatima was one person who was as good as a man because of the knowledge that she had acquired. So therefore one sees that while on the one hand there was a lot of talk of femininity and God as a feminine form, there were also limitations for women in Sufism, and these limitations must be discussed. In the early period, women did succeed men as spiritual guides or as sheikhas. However, we do not find them in such positions for the larger part of the historical period. Other than the famous and the enlightened female Sufis, the presence of other women was not even acknowledged. So here again we see that there was a gradual shift and the way women were acknowledged in the preceding centuries or in the earlier part were not acknowledged in the similar way later on. And a famous Sufi saint of India, Fariduddin Ganjshikar, as I have just discussed, he was very skeptical and he was very sad about the fact that his daughter could not be given the khilafat, that is the headship of an order, as the society did not accept a woman in that position. So was this not a dilemma that while the God itself was being projected as a feminine power, but a woman was not to be accepted as the head of a religious order? Women were not even regular members of the Khanka, though women were accepted as disciples by Sufi masters. So therefore, there were various shades of grays, and one cannot really unilaterally make a statement that Sufis had a far more egalitarian approach towards women. Then another problematic that emerges is the problem of nomenclature. There was no nomenclature in any of the hagiographic works where women's contributions were referred to as those of a devout woman. So the contribution was simply referred to as that of a woman who was of religious bent of mind, but her name was not considered as important enough to be recorded. So there was no personal reference to such a personality, and which makes it difficult to accept them as historical figures. So therefore, there was an attempt to do away with the unique identity or with the important personality that particular woman must be having, and the refusal to acknowledge that speaks volumes about the patriarchal attitude of Sufis. Whereas the same nomenclature was there for the male contributors, but women were not considered as important enough to be identified with their names. So women were seen in different roles in Sufi establishments, as the spiritual guides, as enlightened beings, as the mothers, daughters or wives of sheikhs, providing them with support and guidance whenever required. And in fact, a lot of study has been undertaken for some regional areas like Deccan, and for the Deccan region of India, we find that women were practicing the Sufi verses and thoughts in a number of unique ways, about whom I would be discussing gradually. Now, another very important aspect that one needs to talk about is the linkage between Sufism and folk culture. As the preservers of Sufi knowledge and as composers of biographies, and also as preservers of songs as well as narrations, the important role played by common women who were leading day-to-day lives and who were performing day-to-day activities cannot be overlooked, and also as caretakers of tombs of famous sheikhs, of dargahs. So the principles that were given by Sufis have largely been preserved by women through an ingenious way, that is through folk songs. And it is here that one can talk about a very close linkage that probably existed between Sufism and folk culture, and to be specific here, folk literature and folk songs. So there were several women who across cultures have practiced spirituality, not by falling into that dogmatic way of a spiritual discourse, but by singing songs, by doing ordinary household chores, by doing their day-to-day activities, by singing bhajans, by singing verses, and probably these songs that were part of the local tradition, that were part of the family tradition, contained the teachings of local Sufis who inspired them to lead cleaner and more regulated and religious lives. So it is referred to as Sufiana Kalam. And this Sufiana Kalam became closely interlinked and intertwined with their day-to-day lives. So therefore, they did not need a particular philosophy or a rigid theoretical framework to understand the message of Sufis or folk Islam. Rather, they depended on these various methods and became intrinsically closely interconnected with the religious processes that were going on. Then similar songs were sung by men also in the form of qawwali. Now a great work has been done in this field by Richard Eaton, who has accounted for a number of songs that were sung by women in the Deccan region, and these were known as Chakki Nama, Charkha Nama, Lori Nama and Shadi Nama. So these were a collection of songs, verses that were specifically sung on specific occasions, and it was not as if Lori Nama could be sung while performing any household work, or a Charkhi Nama would be recited while doing chakki work, that is grinding work. So there were specific songs for specific occasions. So while chakki means grinding, charkhi means spinning, and similarly Luri is a lullaby, and shadi refers to marriages. So these were the different occasions when women repeatedly sang these songs while performing their activities, and therefore they played a very important role of spreading the message of Sufis consciously or unconsciously among the wider community. So therefore, one can talk about a very close connection that existed between domesticity and Sufism. So Sufism was not about a very rigid kind of a religious routine that one had to follow, or a very rigid kind of a prayer time that one had to incorporate in one's routine, because these songs were related to domestic activities generally involving women, like grinding, spinning and rocking their children to sleep, and through such daily activities they conveyed the teaching of the Sufis and practiced it also, and this was how the common women benefited from associating with Sufis, and Sufis also benefited a lot because their ideas, their thoughts were being disseminated not only among the wider community, but also in a very personalized form among the newer generations that were coming up. And this partly explains that how Islam became so popular, and it became, and especially Sufism also, spread far and wide. So mystical verses folk literature. Here again one needs to differentiate between these two kind of literary trends, that is mystical as well as folk. So while there was a tendency among many scholars of Sufism to concentrate almost exclusively on the mystical literature as opposed to the folk literature as representing the sum and substance of the Sufi movement, and especially because Sufism was not only about commoners or about laymen accepting this religion, but rather there was lot of political patronage also, and there were specific Sufi orders who were hand in glove with the state, and they kind of accepted state patronage, though there were some Sufi orders who refused to be part of the state patronage, like the Chishti Silsila. So therefore, while in any established Sufi order, there was lot of importance that was given to specifically designed mystical literature and philosophy, and folk literature was hardly any important was hardly considered of any importance. But it was ultimately this folk literature, and it was ultimately the medium of the dispossessed and the commoners, the women and people belonging to the lower castes, that they played a very important and instrument role in spreading the message of the Sufis through the various songs that they sang, both formally as well as informally. So the mystical literature, which can be considered to represent the high tradition, there are two kind of traditions that one can talk of, like something that has been conveyed by the sociologists, that is the little tradition and the high tradition. So high tradition is can be considered as coterminous with Brahmanical thought process and literature. So similarly, even within Islam, there was this concept of high tradition of the Sufi movement in India, which consisted of those treatises on the abstract stages and states that were originally formulated by great mystical thinkers like Ibn al-Arabi. Now this can be described as a very separate and a very as a kind of literature which was placed at a much higher pedestal than the folk literature that ultimately was appropriated by the commoners and especially women. So this literature was written for the edification of fellow Sufis. The kind of literature that I just mentioned, that was championed by Ibn al-Arabi, was not to be amassed by the commoners, but it was specifically for the edification of fellow Sufis, and does not seem to have circulated among the masses, nor was it intended to. So it was specifically for a very select audience, and such literature was usually written in Persian, which was certainly not a vernacular language among the non-elite Indian population of those times. So this also explains the reason that why this theological literature was not popular, or it was not sung, because it was not supposed to be sung like that, and since it was not in the vernacular language, that is the local language, rather it was in Persian, and the commoners were not really well versed in this language. However, when we talk about the folk literature, then immediately the language that comes to one's mind is Dakhani. So there was definitely much larger use of, or an exclusive use of Dakhani, and consisting of a number of short poems that were written in one of the vernacular languages of medieval Bijapur, that is Dakhani. This literature employed indigenous themes, local imagery for the propagation not of complex mystical doctrines, but of a simpler level of Sufi and also of Islamic principles. So here we see a process that was going on at a completely different level, which was definitely coterminous with the little culture, and there was widespread use of local language, there was widespread use of local idioms, local ways of life, activities that were going on. So therefore, since these activities were largely part or a very important part of women's lives, and so therefore there were a number of words that were incorporated in this folk songs or poems, which were again very simple. They were also not very long, so that the reader or the listener or the singer does not lose interest in them, and they were definitely not for propagation of complex mystical doctrines, but rather of simple teachings of Sufis and of Islam. So therefore, women mainly in the 17th and 18th centuries of Bijapur, they were really impressed, and the study shows beautifully that how Sufis belonging to the Chishti order or by their descendants scattered elsewhere in the Deccan, and this literature has been preserved in the oral tradition of Dakkani speaking villagers throughout the Deccan, and many of these songs are sung even today. So therefore, one can emphatically say that women played a very important part in the folk poetry, and it was through this route that they were going to be instrumental in spreading the ideas and the preachings of the Sufis. The bulk of the folk poetry that was written by Sufis was sung by village women, while they were involved in a number of household chores. And the most common types included the Chakki Nama, so called because it was sung while grinding food grains at the Chakki, and this work was primarily being done by women, so therefore they became the main narrators of this. Then the Charkha Nama was sung while spinning the thread at the spinning wheel or the charkha, and the other types of such folk poetry included the Luri Nama or the lullaby. Then the loris were sung while making the baby sleep, and the Shadi Nama or the wedding song. Then there was a Suhagan Nama or a married woman's song, and the Suhela or the eulogistic song, that was sung as one was waiting for someone. Now most of these songs we see were work oriented poetic forms. So they were not to be sung as one was sitting idle, but they were to be sung when one was performing particular functions, particular works that were being performed. And most of these poetic forms appealed exclusively to women, for in the villages of the Deccan, it was the women who for centuries spun the cotton into thread, or they ground the jowar into meal, and they also rocked the children to sleep. So because these were exclusively women oriented tasks, these songs were bound to be popular among them. So the whole concept of singing while doing became instrumental in spreading Sufi philosophy, and each of these activities involved a steady moving of the hands, which the singing of songs composed in regular meter could easily assist. So one can say that these songs also helped in killing the boredom, or in making one get distracted and get immersed in the power of singing, words, music, and the kind of mystical feel that emerged out of this probably helped women in finishing the tasks which otherwise would have taken much longer time, or otherwise which would have appeared much harder tasks. So therefore this is especially true for the Chakki Nama and the Charkha Nama, the most widespread forms of Dakkani folk poetry, both of which involved the turning of a wheel by hand. And in a number of these songs, one also comes across counting in order to assist the women to keep a count on as to how many times they had spun the wheel, and because this greatly impacted the quality of their work. Now, such village poetry appealed to women not only because it accompanied the household chores that they in particular performed, but also because its content was permeated with imagery, especially which was meaningful to them, as has been pointed out by Richard Eaton. So, these songs were very cleverly designed, and they were designed keeping in mind the requirements of women, the kind of specific activities that women were involved in, and therefore the imagery that is found in these songs is of particular relevance and importance. Then a number of these songs also revolve around the theme of female love and life. Now, as far as issue of female love and its manifestations are concerned, these were typical themes in Sufi literature, and the metaphors frequently drew on the two worlds of a young bride. As I just said, that the Sufis used the metaphors in their work, and a young bride was kind of a permanent metaphor that was there. So, the two worlds of a young bride that were increasingly compared were the parental home that she had left behind and her new home, which was her father-in-law's home, and the kind of adjustments that she had to make in the new homes. While the new bride was depicted as being torn between these two worlds, it was also considered important to focus on the aspect of female love and the life that was unfolding. However, it is important that we clarify that these kind of folk songs were not only peculiar among Sufis, or it was not only that Sufis patronized such songs or such verses or such short poems, because there were a number of non-Muslim bhakti poetry examples also that one can quote of, and there were similar developments in the non-Muslim bhakti poetry of the contemporary Deccan. And for example, the Kannada Vachanas of the Lingayats or the Marathi Abhangas of the poet saints of Pandharpur in its use of a vernacular medium, its special appeal to women and its devotional character. And many of these songs also were sung while doing various functions, by performing various jobs by women. It's time and again one can make this statement that how women continued to play an important role in both Sufi as well as Bhakti movement, and indirectly they kind of conveyed the teachings of the masters to the wider audience. So therefore, women can definitely be considered as carriers of Indian folk Islam. The dominant role that was played by women in this Indian folk Islam cannot be underestimated, as women were allowed to enter even the inner circle of a Sufi's followers. Women along with men were instructed in the religious exercises of living Sufis. So here again one sees that while in the earlier centuries this process was more common and it was acceptable, however, from 12th and 13th centuries onwards, there was definitely a break in this process. Now, another very important institution that one must acknowledge and talk about when one is talking about Sufism is that of Dargah. So, what was the role that was played by women in Dargahs, and how this kind of initiated not only incorporation of the female sex in the wider institutionalization of Dargah in the lives of ordinary people, but also in the wider acceptance of Dargah as the most important institution associated with Sufi thought. Once the Sufis died, their place of rest came to be identified by their tombs and it became an object of popular worship, popular veneration, and women came to comprise the great majority of devotees at any given dargah in the Deccan. And this tendency was not only limited to Deccan, but it was definitely far more widespread in Deccan. And the special vows that became associated with individual dargahs were generally associated with fertility. So there was some kind of a mindset that was emerging that a visit to dargah would enhance a woman's fertility, and so therefore the popularity among women of various dargahs increased time and again, and dargahs came to be identified as fertility enhancers, not only as a place for spiritual solace or upliftment, but also as a place which would help women enhance her fertility. Thus, the belief that visits to dargahs would in some measure improve a woman's chance to become a mother became an obvious reason for their continuing popularity among rural women of the Deccan in the past, and even today this trend is largely visible. Now, here again one can talk about the importance of little culture and how it was the little culture which was making its influence directly or indirectly and spreading the idea of Sufi principles and thought. So the non-elite women were largely attracted to these dargahs. Women originally attracted to the Sufis of the 17th century, they participated in the social lives of the dargahs as well. The non-elite women who were living on the fringes of Indian society would have gravitated towards Sufis and their tombs or dargahs as places of religious refuge. So there was some kind of a patronizing attitude about these dargahs, which kind of gave these women a vent went out their exploitation that they were experiencing in their day-to-day lives, or also some kind of a spiritual solace that was available to them in such places. Now, these women included largely widows or childless women of most castes who were attracted to the dargahs because of the latter's association with the cult of fertility. So here again we see that dargah, which was a very important institution related to Sufism, greatly benefited out of its association with dargah, and the repeated visits that women used to make to these dargahs played a very important role in popularizing the dargah as a very important and central institution. What all such women, that is the widows or the childless women, probably shared in common was an eclectic religious attitude, on account of which they would have kind of perceived no great theological or social wall that existed between Islam and Hinduism. For them, the village dargah formed only one more facet of an already diffuse and syncretic religious life. So here again we see that how it was the village women who, out of their specific requirements, who out of their specific life conditions, were attracted towards such places of refuge. And there was it was not as if only Muslim women were visiting these dargahs, because these dargahs were equally popular among women belonging to other religions, and they were considered as important places of refuge. So therefore, there was while there was no great theological importance or no great philosophical principle that was involved in visiting a dargah, but still it became a very important part of their existence, of the rituals that they were kind of following. So one can definitely say that women transmitters of Sufi folk literature were definitely there, and their role needs to be acknowledged. Women who had come into contact with the folk tradition of the dargahs transmitted this tradition to the children living in their households by constantly repeating the poetry of Sufis. Children would be rocked to sleep at night or day by through these loris that they used to sing, which were part of the Lori Nama that had originated in the dargahs. Many of these loris had originated in the dargahs, and these children would also hear chakki namas or charkha namas that were recited daily in their own households, because as the women would be performing these household chores, they would be working on the chakki or on the charkha, and so their children would get a chance to listen to these songs repeatedly, and with each grain that was ground or with each thread that was spun, these songs were always in the background. So the household women in the proximity of children were very instrumental in the transmission of religious practices and attitudes at ritual levels. So one needs to acknowledge this unacknowledged realm and how common women who were performing day-to-day tasks continued to play such instrumental role. Now through this indirect medium, the Sufi folk literature, which invaded the rural households and which gradually gained some kind of an established place amidst the largely eclectic religious life of the rural Deccan, a great change that was coming about was massification of Sufi thought. So various non-elite and predominantly female elements of the rural Deccan Sufi teachings needs to be understood from this perspective. So therefore, the charkha namas or the chakki namas that were recited daily in their own households, each time a grain was being pounded, continued to play a very important and instrumental role in spreading the Sufi thought far and wide. So we cannot really disrespect the common woman who was probably not as accomplished as a Sufi thinker or a Sufi master, but while performing her day-to-day task, she was definitely helping these Sufis in spreading their message. That's all I have to share on this. In case you have any question.
Yes, we have a question, and we would like to ask you, what role did women play in spreading Indian folk Islam?
Yeah, okay. So Indian folk Islam, the very term means that here we are not talking about the mystical or the philosophical side of Islam. The theoretical side of Islam is not being talked about. What we are talking about is the day-to-day songs, the day-to-day verses, the common themes that were part of the folk culture, the folk literature, and the local area, the regional life as it was. So it is in this regard that I would request the students to go through an article by Richard Eaton on how women played a very important role in spreading the message of folk Islam or folk literature, because as they were singing these different kind of songs which I just described as Luri Nama or Chakki Nama or Charkha Nama, they were consciously or unconsciously rather spreading the thoughts, the messages of the Sufi masters. So therefore, this folk literature, which was not definitely a part of any kind of a dogmatic, religious literature, but then in a very unconventional and in a very non-routine kind of a way, or I would say in a temporal kind of a way, this process definitely enhanced the spreading of folk literature.
If we talk about women, what important and how important role she has played other than men while spreading the Sufism?
Yeah, so here again one can say that women are always working, they are always doing something. either they are making children, taking care of children, putting them to sleep, or they are grinding the corn, they are grinding the grains, or they are kind of doing some household work. So while performing these functions, most of these folk traditions were specifically designed for women singers. For women, as they were performing these functions, they would be singing these songs. So since men were not performing these functions, they would not even be singing them. So therefore, they became a very important and instrumental role. They played a very important role in spreading the Sufi message to the next generation, something which the men of their families were not doing, because they were probably outside the homes, or even if they were in the homes, they were resting, they were not working. And most of these songs were designed in such a way that they were to be sung while performing any particular function. So here I would say that since women were doing and men were not doing, so women were singing and men were not singing.
Well, listener, thank you, and thank you so much for giving us this productive session on Sufism and women. Friends, we believe that you might have gathered lots and lots of information through this session, and you might have certain questions also. Friends, we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube very soon, and after watching this lecture the number of times you wanted on YouTube, you can put forward your questions. You can ask your questions through our email ID. Our email ID is info.cec@nic.in, as well as you can post your questions including your feedbacks at the same ID, and we'll try to give answers to your questions when next time Dr. Shruti Webb visits our studio. We are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon. Thank you for watching CEC Gurukul Live Lectures. Thank you, and thank you once again.
Thanks a lot.